No administration has accomplished more in the first 90 days.
Keeping him honest, that is just not true. And not only when looking at the conventional expectations that any administration is measured against, there are also what you might call self-imposed challenges to justify early morning tweets and unsubstantiated claims, or in some cases to fulfill promises he made to get something done by some specific deadline. For example, during the transition, President-elect Trump put out a statement on cyber attacks saying, quote, "Whether it is our government, organizations, associations, or businesses we need to aggressively combat and stop cyber attacks, I will appoint a team to give me a plan within 90 days of taking office." It's been 90 days, pretty much crickets on that. We asked White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer about it. We've got no comment. According to Politico, quoting a National Security Council spokesman, the NSC is not involved in drafting any plan, and neither is Rudy Giuliani, who was given the job of building cybersecurity partnerships with the private sector. In any case, the calendar speaks for itself. It's been 90 days, no report. Then there's this, which doesn't involve a specific deadline, but certainly suggests something important enough to treat urgently. The president's claim he would have won the popular vote were it not for millions of people who voted illegally. Millions, which would be the biggest case of voter fraud in American history, which didn't happen. He said it on Twitter. He said it to lawmakers. He offered no evidence to back it up. Then, as pressure grew, he said this.
I'm going to set up a commission to be headed by Vice President Mike Pence, and we're going to look at it very, very carefully.
So that was Super Bowl Sunday. More than a month and a whole lot of radio silence later, Sean Spicer was asked for a progress report on whether any evidence had come to light yet.
Well, I think that's why he's asked Vice President Pence to look into it. I would disagree with the assertion that I think there's also factual, evidence of people voting illegally. We saw that in Texas a couple weeks ago, and in other places. So part of the reason that he's asking Vice President Pence to chair this task force is to look into the issue.
Just for fact's sake, no evidence of millions of people illegally voting. You heard him there saying the president is asking the vice president to look into it, asking a month and 3 days after the president announced that he was. Keeping him honest, not only had nothing been done back then, nothing appears to have been done even since then. Late tonight, a senior White House official tells us the formation of a Pence commission, quote, has not been a topic of a lot of conversation in the White House, and said that they had not spoken with the vice president about it recently either. Let's just remember, this would be the largest incident of voter fraud in U.S. history. It would be a huge scandal. It would be a massive deal. But so far, no commission actually looking into it on the vice president's part. Reached for comment late tonight, Sean Spicer would only say he expects something on the commission within the next week or two. Now, in fairness, every president has at one time or another failed to fulfill certain promises, even in the broadest possible interpretation of any given pledge. Circumstances change, so do priorities. That said, it's hard not to see at least some of this as the White House simply making big promises or the president making promises while hoping we don't notice the lack of actual follow-through. We do, and so do voters. New Gallup polling shows just 45% surveyed now believe the president is someone who keeps his promises. That's down 17 points since February. I want to talk about Jeffrey Lord, Kirsten Powers, and Ryan Lizza. Jeff, I mean, do you see these as a number of promises not delivered on, promises not even pursued? I mean, isn't the voter fraud thing such a major allegation that if you say you're going to set up some sort of a commission?
I think that there's room for some honest criticism here, but I think there's also things going on. For instance, with the cyber task force, that's being headed by former Mayor Giuliani, and it's my understanding that they have been pulling together white papers on the subject. They have a staff person assigned to it. They've not yet reached out to government agencies on this, but they are getting their ducks in a row here to do
90 days was what the president said.
Right, I understand, but it is underway. On voter fraud, I honestly don't know, and I note that Hans von I can never say his last name, Spakovsky, has not been asked yet, and I would hope that he is going to be involved in this, because this is somebody who has a whole data bank of voter fraud around the country and its history and knows a great deal about the subject.
Who is that?
Thank you very much, Anderson. Hans von Spakovsky
okay.
from the Heritage Foundation.
Sure, okay. Kirsten, what do you make of this? I mean, is this just, it does seem like, the president says things and has, throughout his career as a developer said things, and the more he says them, people start to believe they're true. But as president, when you say you're going to do something and then it just never materializes, it does, after a while, raise some questions.
Yeah, I mean, look, I do think that Donald Trump makes a lot of promises, and he does sort of He's very hyperbolic, and he says a lot, makes a lot of promises. If you look at the promises he made for his first 100 days, he sort of casts it as though this has been the greatest first 100 days of any time. And in fact, when you look at what's actually happened, frankly, very little has happened by historical standards. I mean, even if you look, he has no major piece of legislation. The main thing he said he was going to do with Obamacare, repealing Obamacare, hasn't happened. They are trying to make it happen in the first 100 days, but hasn't done it. Most of the, he's signed a lot of executive orders. A lot of them are undoing things. They're not even creating new initiatives. They're just undoing initiatives that the Obama administration did. So I think he made a lot of promises and unfortunately hasn't really been able to deliver on a lot of them.
Ryan, I mean, the fact of the matter is President Trump has spent his life making big pronouncements about himself, his wealth, his company. So doing that during his presidency, I mean, it shouldn't be all that surprising.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, he does have a bit of a history of over-promising and under-delivering, which often what White Houses do in the first 100 days is they try and do the opposite. They try and set expectations a lot lower. Both the Obama and the Bush White Houses tried to get journalists to not even pay attention to the 100-day mark because they argued, and I covered both of them. I remember the White House press offices trying to tell us, oh, this 100-day mark is artificial. And the truth is they have a good point to that, right? The 100-day mark comes out of the FDR's administration. We're in the middle of a major crisis, and he had massive goodwill in Congress. He could have, passed anything he wanted. So his 100 days was incredibly energetic, and he did a lot. Most presidents don't have those circumstances. If you want to compare Trump with Obama, Obama's first 100 days was much more, he passed a lot more legislation, he did a whole lot more, but he too was in the middle of a crisis and had big margins in Congress. I think the biggest problem that Trump has is he has a divided Republican Party in the Congress and unified opposition among Democrats, so it's very hard for him to pass any legislation, as we saw with health care. And then on the campaign trail, he made a lot of promises that he sort of smushed into this, he'd do in the first 60 days or first 100 days without really thinking carefully about what those first few months would be like. And he's paying a bit of a price now as we go through those promises and see what he's done and what he hasn't.
Jeff, the president has said a number of times, as Kirsten pointed out, that no administration has accomplished more in the first 90 days. I mean, you would agree that is not the case, right? I mean, just from a sheer legislation standpoint, or whatever metric you want to judge it from. Well,
I think in terms of executive orders and things of that nature, I mean, certainly the accomplishment of getting Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court, that's a very big deal. That's going to have a generational impact.
But that's one legislative thing.
Right. Well, but it's a big one. It's a very big one.
Right. Others have been.
As I can attest, there are presidents, including President Reagan, who couldn't get that accomplished on occasion. So that's a big deal. So. And I do that. Ryan is right. I mean, this is, and the Bush and Obama White House had it right. I mean, this is vastly overblown. And what's going to happen here, Anderson, is we're going to have a whole flurry of stories about this when the 100-day mark hits. And then we'll move on. At the end of the Trump administration, 4 years, 8 years, whatever, that's when history will start to judge. It's not going to be the first 100 days.
Jeffrey, one of my points was that it's the Trump White House that is sort of promoting this 100-day mark, and it's President Trump who's saying he has had the most successful 90 days of any president, and that's what is surprising because it's just not true. So you would expect them to sort of play down expectations.
Yeah, certainly not doing that. Thank you, everyone. Coming up next is Ryan. As Ryan Lism mentioned, we'll get to that other promise the president made to repeal and replace Obamacare. Progress